It was just after 3 a.m. on a warm summer's night on the morning of June 28, 1993. An old, tan-coloured Mazda pickup truck quietly rolled down the Southern State Parkway on Long Island, New York. The warm night air was thick, and so was the smell emanating from the back of the truck. It was approaching 3:15 a.m. when State Troopers Deborah Spargaren and Sean Ruane, who were working the graveyard shift in East Meadow, spotted a pickup truck with no license plate ahead of them. A minor infraction, the kind usually resolved with a brief traffic stop. The troopers activated their sirens and flashing red lights in an attempt to pull the driver of the Mazda over, but the driver refused. Instead of stopping, the vehicle kept moving, not quickly, but with an unsettling steadiness, appearing oblivious to law enforcement's pursuit of them. Attempts were made by Ruane to communicate to the driver over the loudspeaker, but was ignored entirely. Then, without warning, the driver accelerated, taking the next off-ramp and heading into the residential streets of Wantagh. The pursuit was now active, and additional units were called in. Soon, 5 more patrol cars had joined the chase as the truck weaved through the dark suburban roads. It ended roughly 20 minutes later when the driver missed a turn in Mineola and struck a telephone pole with such force that it fell, bringing the vehicle and the chase to an abrupt stop. With their pistols drawn, the police quickly descended to the vehicle. The driver was removed at gunpoint, offering no resistance. He was frisked for weapons, and the police discovered an X-Acto knife in his pocket. Handcuffs were promptly wrapped around the man's wrists, and his license was found in the vehicle, identifying him as 34-year-old Joel David Rifkin. At first glance, there was little that stood out. Disheveled, with a faint layer of skin cream smeared across his parted mustache, Rifkin appeared quiet, compliant. But something was peculiar about the arrest. The officers noticed a sharp odour, not the scent of engine oil or gasoline, but of something unmistakable. The smell of putrescine and cadaverine, the smell of decomposition. They moved to the bed of the truck, where a blue tarp had been secured with rope. Something was evidently wrapped inside, and a clear attempt had been made to hide what it was. When the tarp was pulled back, the remains of a young woman were found. Her body had been deceased for several days. Rifkin, now in handcuffs, confirmed what the officers had already suspected. The body was that of 22-year-old Tiffany Bresciani. Tiffany Bresciani was born on March 10, 1971, in Metairie, Louisiana. Her mother, Cheryl, described her as a joyful child, someone who loved people and had a bright, theatrical energy. Tiffany dreamed of the stage, hoping to one day perform on Broadway, drawn to the idea of life in the city and the freedom it promised. But like many who come to New York chasing ambition, her path didn't unfold the way she imagined. In the final 2 years of her life, she had become involved with drugs and sex work and would dance in clubs around Manhattan. It was during this time that she crossed paths with Joel Rifkin, leading to her fateful end. When asked why her body was in the back of his vehicle, Rifkin explained to the officers that Tiffany was a prostitute who he had solicited the services from in Manhattan. He claimed that something went wrong during their encounter, and that he strangled her, describing her death in clinical detail and completely devoid of emotion. This detachment led the detectives to wonder if she was really his first victim. Rifkin had been on his way to dispose of Tiffany's body near Republic Airport when the state troopers noticed the missing license plate and attempted to stop him. But by the time they found her, Bresciani had already been dead for several days. The odour in the vehicle was overwhelming. The officers noticed that Rifkin had applied Noxema to his upper lip, apparently in an attempt to mask the smell. A detail disturbingly similar to a scene from Silence of the Lambs, released 2 years earlier. On the surface, the case appeared straightforward. A man caught transporting a body with little effort to hide what he had done. But Rifkin didn't hesitate. He told detectives that Tiffany was number 17. A prolific 4-year killing spree had ended because of a missing license plate. But who was Joel Rifkin, and how did he manage to evade detection for so long while quietly carrying out one of New York's most brutal killing sprees? Joel David Rifkin was born on January 20, 1959, to 2 college students who were unable to take care of a child. He was adopted 3 weeks later by Bernard and Jean Rifkin, a middle-class couple from Long Island. His upbringing was, on the surface, quite normal, despite for some beratement from his father for his poor academic performance. From a young age, Joel struggled to connect with his peers. There was something about his personality and his demeanour that defined him as an immediate outsider to the other children at school. Notably, he had poor posture and an awkward gait, earning himself nicknames like Turtle and Lard Ass. The bullying was constant. He would be ostracised by his peers, regularly be excluded from games, team sports, and always made to be the butt of the joke. The bullying started with ridicule, but it would quickly develop and escalate to physical assaults. His bullies did things like dunk his head in toilets, threw eggs at him while he was using the gym showers, stole his lunch and clothes, and they'd pull his pants down. But, rather than fight back, Rifkin sought acceptance. He invited classmates over to watch TV or drink beer, hoping to make friends. Many of them later admitted that they were simply using him. One former classmate described Rifkin as an abuse unit and subtly obnoxious, someone whose presence seemed to irritate others without reason. Academically, he failed to thrive. His grades were poor, not because of a lack of intelligence. He tested with a borderline genius IQ of 128, but due to what would later be identified as severe dyslexia. Hoping to improve his social standing, Rifkin joined the yearbook committee. His camera was stolen early on, but he continued to contribute, determined to see the yearbook published. Despite his efforts, he was excluded from the end-of-year party, which left him absolutely devastated, according to his mother. To lift his spirits, his parents gifted him a car, a generous gift, one that, years later, would take on a far darker significance. Rifkin began using the car to search for and solicit sex workers from Hempstead to Manhattan. He became consumed by these encounters. He was often scammed, robbed, and manipulated, and yet he kept returning to the streets. Rifkin's private life grew increasingly isolated. He began fantasizing about violence, describing later in interviews fantasies involving bondage, forced encounters, and even scenarios of women fighting like gladiators to the death. After watching Alfred Hitchcock's Frenzy in 1972, a film about a serial killer who strangles women with a necktie, Rifkin became fixated on the idea of strangulation. His fantasies grew darker, more frequent, and more detailed. He graduated high school in 1977, ranking near the bottom of his class. He reasoned to himself that life could only get better once he attended college, but he continued to struggle to focus. His academic life slowly unraveled as he became increasingly preoccupied with life on the street. According to Rifkin, he was robbed by sex workers or their associates more than a dozen times and even fell for the same ruse by the same person on multiple occasions. By 1989, his emotional volatility, sexual fixation, and long-standing feelings of humiliation had reached a breaking point. All that was left for Rifkin now was to find a target and unleash his fury. In the early spring of 1989, Rifkin's macabre fantasies quickly became reality when he began to plan the demise of his first victim. By February, Rifkin's mother had left town for several weeks, leaving their family home in East Meadow solely in the hands of Joel Rifkin. He was presented with the opportunity he'd been waiting for. On a cold night in Manhattan's East Village, Joel Rifkin drove through the dim streets in search of a woman. He spotted someone standing alone, thin and tired looking, scanning cars as they passed by. Rifkin approached the woman, and she got into his truck without hesitation. For her, it was just another job, a way to get through the night. But for him, it was the moment everything changed. Rifkin would later tell police that her name was Susie. That was all he remembered. They drove out of Manhattan and back to his mother's empty house on Long Island for a bit more privacy. Along the way, she asked him to stop several times to buy crack cocaine to feed her drug dependency. After they arrived at his home, they had sex, unenthusiastically. Once their tangle was over, Susie again asked Rifkin to take her out in search of drugs. But something in Rifkin snapped. He furiously beat her, claiming later that he only stopped when he grew tired. But Susie was still alive. She fought back, biting his finger deeply before he overpowered and strangled her. The moment the glistening light faded from Susie's eyes had awoken something deep within Rifkin. She was his first, but he knew that she certainly wouldn't be his last. Afterward, he cleaned up the scene, wrestling her lifeless body into a plastic trash bag, wiping up the blood and the signs of combat in his living room. Soon after, he would sleep for several hours as if nothing ever happened. When he awakened, he moved the body into the basement, placing it on top of the washer and dryer, using it as a makeshift operating table. Using an X-Acto knife, he dismembered her. He severed her fingertips, plucked her teeth with pliers, and placed her severed head inside of a paint can to ensure she would never be identified. The task would never haunt Rifkin, later explaining that he described the process as a lesson in biology. Susie's remaining body parts were placed into garbage bags and then into Rifkin's mother's car, to be scattered across Manhattan and New Jersey. He thought his victim would never be found, but he had been careless. On 5th of March, 1989, a member from the Hopewell Valley Golf Club sliced his ball into the woods along the 17th green. While searching for his ball through the thick vegetation, the golfer stumbled across an out-of-place paint can. Curious, he decided to open the can and would discover Susie's head. A month later, on 8th of April, Susie's legs would be discovered in Pequannock Creek, near Jefferson Township, New Jersey. The case caught the headlines, and Rifkin would follow the reported case to ensure that there were no leads pointing at him. Police would prepare artist renderings and a forensic reconstruction of the victim, and check them against a list of 700 missing women. But her case remained unsolved until Rifkin confessed to her murder in 1993. She remained unidentified and was nicknamed Susie, the only name Rifkin had offered years later when he eventually confessed to the crime. Without knowing any of her other details, the lead did not provide the police with enough information to formally identify her. Periodically, over the years, detectives would pick up the case and make efforts at determining who she was. The detectives would obtain the names of all of the known prostitutes around that time and compare their photos to the composite of the severed head until, years after her discovery, they finally had a breakthrough in the case. Their search led to New York, where investigators had a strong match to a woman who had gone by the name Susan Spencer, and about 15 other names. Without any further leads, the young woman would be identified as Susie for many years later, until detectives decided to pick up the case once again for a final time. After chasing aliases and false social security numbers attached to the woman, tracing to Ohio and Florida, detectives went to those states to check missing persons reports until they recognized the name the woman had once used. The detectives correlated the name to a face on a missing persons website, and what they saw stood out at them. It was the face of Heidi Bulk, but Heidi was only reported as a missing person in New York in 2001 after her auntie became concerned about her whereabouts. The problem was, while making the report, her auntie told police that her niece was last seen in 1995. Still, the team decided to pursue the lead and paid her auntie a visit. Not only did the detectives learn that the sighting in 1995 was inaccurate secondhand information, they also learned that the Bulks' parents were alive and living in Maryland and Florida. At the time of Susie, or Heidi's, discovery, DNA testing was still in its infancy. However, later breakthroughs in this technology would assist police to help determine the young woman's identity. In 2013, DNA technology had advanced so significantly that the remains of Susie were able to be accurately determined as those of Heidi Bulk. Expectedly, Bulk's parents expressed shock once the DNA results confirmed her daughter's identity. They knew in their hearts that something awful had happened to Heidi, but they'd never imagined that she was the first victim of Joel Rifkin. Rifkin would wait more than a year to strike again and claim his second victim, but from there was no stopping him until he was finally caught 4 years later. Quickly gaining experience, murder was becoming easy for Rifkin. Rifkin would not kill again for over a year, but once he resumed, the killings escalated. Over the next 4 years, he took the lives of at least 16 more women. He often picked up sex workers in Manhattan and brought them back to Long Island, sometimes even while his mother was home asleep. The secrecy, the pattern, and the apparent randomness allowed him to operate undetected until that final drive on Southern State Parkway in June 1993. In his private life, Joel Rifkin had developed a deep fascination with other serial killers, particularly Ted Bundy. He studied their cases, emulated their behaviors, and in some instances, tried to replicate their crimes. Over this time, his murders became more frequent, and increasingly reckless as he gave in to his impulses more frequently. He began making disturbing remarks to the women he solicited, asking if they wanted to die, just moments before killing them. But his carelessness would catch up to him. Rifkin began discarding bodies in public places, near highways, in creeks, sometimes not far from residential areas. He believed they would be overlooked, just like his victims had been for years. It wasn't intelligence that kept him hidden. It was just indifference from institutions, systems, and a society that largely ignored the disappearance of vulnerable women. It was only after the discovery of Tiffany Bresciani's body that Rifkin was exposed. Her death, a simple traffic stop, would unravel everything. During his interrogation, in the absence of legal counsel, Rifkin would admit to 17 murders by name, going into meticulous details about the way he ended their lives and sketching maps to help the police find those victims who were still missing with total dispassion. He would detail his victims with murders, many of which were previously unknown. Rifkin's arrest led to a series of highly publicized trials. On July 15, 1993, he pleaded not guilty to the murder of Tiffany Bresciani, citing insanity. Throughout the legal proceedings, he repeatedly dismissed his attorneys, a tactic seen by many as an attempt to feign mental illness. Jury selection began on 11th of April 1994. A panel of 7 men and 5 women was confirmed, with opening arguments beginning 9 days later on 20th of April. The trial presented the jury with disturbing testimony, a chronicle of violent and sadistic crimes carried out with cold precision. Rifkin appeared disinterested in his own case during the proceedings, at times falling asleep. His lawyer later attributed his poorly timed naps to a food allergy from jail-issued bologna sandwiches. One of the most telling moments came from forensic psychiatrist Dr. Barbara Kerwin. After reviewing Rifkin's psychological evaluations, she described his results as the most pathological she had ever seen in over 2 decades of clinical work. The jury did not take long to reach a verdict. On May 9, 1994, they found Joel Rifkin guilty of murder and reckless endangerment in connection with both Tiffany Bresciani's death and the police pursuit that led to his capture. By January 1996, Rifkin had been convicted of the murders of 7 women and was sentenced to 183 years in prison. Judge Robert Hanafi, addressing the court, said, "In case there is such a thing as reincarnation, I want you to spend your second life in prison." Rifkin would later be convicted of an additional 2 murders. Although charges for the remaining victims were never formally laid due to the lack of definitive evidence, his combined sentences now total 203 years to life. He is serving time at Clinton Correctional Facility in New York and will not be eligible for parole until the year 2197, at the age of 238. Joel Rifkin's case laid bare the ways in which violent crimes against marginalized people, especially sex workers and drug-affected women, were often ignored. He was not particularly clever. He did not operate with precision or cunning. He simply targeted individuals who were overlooked, unprotected, and in many cases, never reported missing. His ability to evade justice for so long said less about him and more about the systems that failed to notice. And for years, Rifkin was right. Many of his victims weren't searched for. Their names weren't in the papers. Their faces weren't shown on the news, and they were treated as though they were invisible. In a more recent interview with A&E, Rifkin would go on to say that if he were never caught, his spree would have continued. The exposure of Rifkin's crimes led to public scrutiny. It raised uncomfortable questions about how law enforcement, the media, and the public view victims involved in sex work. And in time, it contributed to a broader push, not just in New York, but across the United States of America, to treat these cases as the serious, violent crimes they are. Crimes that deserve the same attention, urgency, and respect as any other. Not all of Rifkin's victims have been formally identified. Some still remain unnamed, their lives remembered only through confession, sketch, and speculation. But what remains undeniable is that every one of them mattered.